Thanks, Stephen. So my name's John Dickinson. I have no musical talent whatsoever, so I'm not going to sing, I'm not going to play a piano. I can play triangle every now and again, but that's all I've got. So my background is as a sports scientist, and the way I've sort of got into breathing and breathing disease is by looking at athletes. And you might think an Olympic athlete should be like the Formula One car of a human being. There shouldn't be anything wrong with them. What is actually the case is actually they're being held together by all sorts of sticky tape and bands and things, and they're basically pushing their bodies to the limit. And because they're doing that, they put their bodies under stress, and then they actually are more likely to suffer from respiratory issues. So we know in elite athletes that they suffer from a lot of respiratory issues. So I work across a breadth of Olympic champions, elite football players, tennis players, and they all report respiratory symptoms is the most common complaint of someone who's an elite athlete. Common diseases that elite athletes have are asthma. So we know that in the British Olympic team, about 20% of the British Olympic team have an asthmatic condition. When you can consider that to the general population, it's about 9% of the general population have an asthmatic condition. So it could be, sometimes in elite sport, they're more likely to suffer from conditions like asthma than the general population, and we need to manage it. But what we also see is some athletes report symptoms of tight chest, difficulty in breathing, and when we actually test them for asthma, they don't have asthma. So some of the studies we've done with elite athletes suggest that if you just give an inhaler based on symptoms alone, you get the diagnosis wrong 50% of the time. And you probably all experienced going to the doctors. I don't know if anyone's been diagnosed with asthma in the room, and you walk into the doctors, explain your symptoms, they tell you to do a little peak flow test, and they decide whether you have asthma or not from that. Now we know that diagnosis isn't particularly sensitive or specific. Yeah, but you'd be surprised how many athletes I see who haven't had a proper test, and they have been diagnosed that way, and they shouldn't be diagnosed that way. So I'd probably be a bit straightforward with that one. But anyway, we see a lot of athletes that don't have appropriate testing. So a lot of the time we go around and we test them. So, for example, elite football players, 50% of them who've been given an inhaler couldn't provide a positive test for asthma. So they've been misdiagnosed. A lot of these athletes had symptoms though. So they had tight chest, difficulty in breathing. Okay. Now these are sort of two things that I see on quite a regular basis. So this is an athlete who had been told she had asthma in the build-up to the Olympic Games, and they treated her for asthma. Unfortunately, she came fourth. But she'd been trying to compete with this condition, and she'd been told it was asthma, and the asthma inhalers didn't help it, but the doctor that she was working with insisted that asthma was the issue. So let's listen to her. Hear that noise? It's not a particularly healthy noise, but she'd been going to the doctor saying that she was wheezing when she was doing hard exercise. Wheezing is a symptom of asthma, but it's not the only symptom. It's not exclusive to asthma. That's an inspiratory wheeze. That individual had a laryngeal obstruction, so when she was breathing in, her larynx was closing in. And we can all sort of make our larynx close in, so we can all make that noise. But potentially the way she's breathing is what's causing that issue, because when we retrained her breathing, that laryngeal obstruction went away. So it's about understanding what's going on. The other issues we see with an athlete is that, again, this is a Olympic silver medalist, and this is actually after the Olympic Games in Rio, and she's developed a breathing pattern where if you look at her stomach and look at her chest, you can see they're not moving in time. So you can see her stomach pops out and her chest pops out. She's complaining when she's in the pool that she feels that her chest is tight and she can't get enough air in during her session, so she's slowing down and she was convinced her tight chest was because of a heart condition. But she went for CPET, she went for ECGs, they all came back normal, blood tests all came back normal, and I had to explain to her it was purely down to the mechanics of her breathing as to why she was struggling like this. And these are the sort of issues that we see when we work with athletes. And so that's where my expertise is. But Stephen sort of found me out when I moved down to Kent. I think it was 2013, I think was when we first had our first chat. Because Stephen had been doing work with singers, and some of the early work that he'd been doing with COPD patients was suggesting that it was improving their lung function as well as their well-being. So we wanted to do some more physiological investigations into it. If you're not aware what COPD is, it stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which basically means that when you try and breathe air out, you can't breathe out as fast as you'd like to breathe out. It doesn't actually limit the volume of air that somebody can breathe, it more limits the speed it comes out at. It's a combination of bronchitis, emphysema, and it can also be asthma, and depending on the individual, it effectively results in airflow obstruction. So we look at bronchiolitis. Effectively, that's a swelling of the airway lining here, and effectively when you try and breathe air out, because the lumen's smaller, there's a smaller gap for the air to fly through, so it's going to come out slower, essentially. The other aspect is emphysema. That's sort of a destruction of the walls of the lungs, become less flexible, so therefore it's harder for them to push the air out of them. So depending on the individual with COPD, one or both of those, along with asthma, plays a role in narrowing that airway and making it harder for the individual to breathe air out. I don't know if anyone has asthma or COPD in the room, but I'm sure you've been exposed to doing a maximal flow volume loop test, where you do a nice big deep breath in and you breathe into a tube as hard and as fast as you can for as long as you can, and then you can breathe back in again. And what we do, we can measure flow rate against volume. So when someone first breathes out, air flies out, and in this case, this individual is getting to 10 litres per second, which is quite a decent rate. And then the more air you breathe out, the slower it comes out, and then this person's got to 6 litres, and then they breathe back in again. And that's the sort of shape you'd expect to see off quite a healthy lung function. So this is one of our elite rowers' lung function. If you can sit that on top of someone who's age-matched with COPD, and height and weight and everything else, and you look at their lung function, this is what their expiratory loop looks like. So the actual volume of air doesn't change too much, so they can still breathe out 6 litres of air, but you can see the flow rate they are initially able to get to is lower, and as soon as they hit that flow rate, the flow rate they're able to maintain shuts down. And so when they're breathing out a very slow flow rate. So in a healthy lung, it takes around about 6 seconds to empty your airways. With someone with COPD, it can take 10, 15, 20, or 30 seconds, depending on how severe the COPD is. So if you think about that in terms of life, it's obviously trying to perform everyday activity on these sort of lungs suddenly becomes a challenge. So just literally walking to the shops. One of the things I really appreciated with working with COPD patients when we first started working with Stephen, we initially had a group come and just try the test out. We got here at the end of 2013, and we asked them to come to the university campus and park in the car park, and it's probably about a 400-metre walk from the car park to our labs. And we were expecting them at 10 o'clock, and at 10:05 we got a call, and we said, and it was for the patients that were coming in, and said, "We're here, we're in the car park, we don't think we can make it from the car park to the lab." And so we had to basically allow them to drive through some barriers and get them in. And that's probably the first thing I really realised how debilitating COPD can be for some people. And these are just some numbers, and I'm not going to talk for everyone, there's lots of numbers up there, but I'll just point a few key ones out. So if we want to compare healthy individuals to COPD individuals, we've recently just done some measurements on some COPD singers versus some healthy singers. And some of the key variables we're looking at when we're looking at lung health is this measurement here called FEV1, and that basically stands for the amount of air that you can breathe out in 1 second. And for a healthy age-matched individual, they're getting around about 2.6 litres of air out in 1 second when they breathe out as hard and as fast as they can. The group of COPD singers are getting out 1.3 litres of air. So half the amount of air is coming out in 1 second when you compare to an age-match healthy singer. There's not too much difference, though, in the actual volume of air they're breathing out. But when we actually look at the ratio, which is the bottom bit here, so these healthy lungs, these individuals are getting about 76% of the air that they breathe out, of the total amount of air they breathe out in the first second, whereas the COPD patients are getting less than half of their air out in 1 second compared to the total breath. So they're basically much less efficient in getting air out. What that essentially means, though, if we look at COPD, what it can cause, if we've got COPD, one of the biggest symptoms that they report is dyspnea, which is basically difficulty in breathing when you start doing activity. If you feel tight-chested, you're not going to do an activity, so you're going to sort of remove yourself from symptoms you don't like. So a lot of individuals don't like feeling tight-chested and out of breath, so they start to become immobile. That has knock-on effects. So we start to become immobile. That might lead to social isolation. It might lead to lack of fitness. That social isolation might lead to depression, and the lack of fitness, again, both of those two things might lead back to dyspnea. And then we start that negative circle around, getting more breathless, becoming more immobile, becoming more socially isolated, and it can be a big melting pot. And what we're trying to do when we intervene with individuals with COPD is deal with this dyspnea issue, so we don't start on this negative spiral, and we try and allow an individual with COPD to achieve as much as they can with their life, knowing the fact that once an individual has COPD, so it's chronic, we can't reverse it, so we can't give them the lungs that they had when they were 20 again. We have to manage what they've got and try and allow them to perform as much physical activity as possible, symptom-free, so they can enjoy the maximum of their life that they have, rather than sort of suffering through it. So there's sort of very clear medical strategies in place. There's people are aware of pulmonary rehabilitation as well, where that involves some social support as well as some fitness programs, fitness sessions, and they've been shown to be really beneficial to help. But a lot of individuals don't necessarily get on with the exercise. They've sort of developed this immobility, a bit of a block. I can't exercise. The patients that arrived in our car park can't walk 400 metres, so it can become a bit of a block to say, well, just go and exercise. It will help you. It will get you better. So we're looking for other solutions, and this is sort of where the work that Stephen started to do with singing and COPD. Can singing help with these issues? Can it help with the control of the breath? Will that then allow individuals to feel that they can do more in a day, so they become more mobile? Does that mean because they're singing, they've got less social isolation because they're with a group? They've got a meaning to actually go and walk to the group, so they actually become a bit more of a purpose. Can they get social groups together? And so suddenly this negative spiral becomes a positive spiral. And so singing potentially can help that. And we've sort of done various projects to try and evidence the benefits of singing with COPD, which Stephen can maybe talk about in a little bit. But one of the things we're quite interested in is actually we know people with COPD who sing report reduction in dyspnea. So they feel better. It makes them feel better. When we actually measure their maximal lung function, though, so the measurements of FEV1 and FVC, they don't tend to change too much. So we're not making someone's lung function improve. So why are they feeling that they can breathe better? When we've measured their 6-minute walk test, we don't see too much change in a 6-minute walk test before and after someone started in a singing program. So that's not sensitive enough to pick out these reports of change in dyspnea. So we started to look more at, actually, is it about the way they're controlling their breathing? So is singing allowing people with COPD to control their breathing better, which ultimately allows them to feel less breathless and do more with what they've got? The difficulty in trying to measure that is quite difficult to measure breathing pattern. Okay? The best way we've got is to do something like this. This is what we do with our athletes. We can use a system called optoelectronic plasmography. Very easy title to say. And basically what this is, it's a bit like making avatars in films. So we stick all these reflective markers on a torso. You've got cameras in the back that are infrared cameras, and they're essentially just tracking the movement of these markers while someone's breathing. And so you can basically recreate the chest wall here, and you can map the way someone's breathing. So you can look at the upper chest, the lower chest, and the abdomen, and look at how they're all moving together, which is quite interesting. And again, it's not really used on a large scale. This isn't really used in practice with patients, because it takes about 2 hours to marker somebody up, and then it takes about a day to actually look at all the data that you've got to make any sense of it. So it's not really useful from a practicality point of view working with patients, but it does start to give us some information about how individuals breathe, because we've all got ideas in the room probably about what a good breath is. But when you actually turn to science and say, well, what is a good breath? There's very, very little information there about how to breathe properly. No, you're not taught to breathe, you just breathe. And to go back to our athletes, that they're not taught to breathe at the top end of exercise, they just figure it out. And it's the same way, you can look on the internet and there'll be all sorts of people's little tricks and things about how to breathe, but no one really knows. So we're trying within the university to try and map what good breathing is, and that could be with healthy individuals, could be with singers, could be with athletes, and try and get an idea of what you'd expect to see in a healthy breath versus an individual with disease breathing. We've done that a little bit in the university, and we've looked at this during cycling. And what we see is if we ask someone to sort of breathe normally, and then we ask them to hunch their shoulders so they sort of fix their shoulders so they're in a hunch position, we see if you cycle in a hunch position, you start to limit the movement of your chest. So if you think about individuals who hold themselves really tight and tense up here, effectively they're putting more resistance on their upper chest wall, so it's less likely to move. And if that's less likely to move, it means that you're going to get less air in per breath. And that's what we saw here. So you see tidal volumes drop off a little bit if someone's hunched up. So the amount of air they're breathing per breath drops. We see less movement in the rib cage when you compare it to the abdomen. So basically the abdomen's moving more than the rib cage because you've sort of locked your upper rib cage up. So we can see that posture has potentially has an effect on the amount of air you can breathe in, but also your perception of how that feels. Because if you're wanting to take a big deep breath in, but you physically can't because you're all locked up and tight, that's going to impact how much air you can get in. So you're going to report, I've got a tight chest, I can't breathe in. Whereas if you relax your shoulders off, you're going to be able to move that chest wall and get more air in. So you get and breathe less times per minute, and that's all going to have a knock-on effect to how you're feeling. So we started to look at various different ways to actually measure breathing pattern. And this is what we've got set up here, and we're really lucky that Hamza's come down from Pneumacare today to sort of demonstrate how this works. And what we're going to do is, in a minute, we're going to get our three guinea pigs to sit in front of the device. We're going to do some measurements, and then we'll be able to talk through what we can see. But essentially the way it works is it's trying to measure breathing pattern non-invasively. So effectively all you need to do is pop a tight shirt on, as demonstrated over here, and we just project light onto that shirt, and then the device will track the movement of that light as you're breathing. And we can detect inspiratory, expiratory movements, we can detect speed of the movement, we can start to split that grid up, so we can look at chest versus abdomen, we can look at whether the chest and abdomen are moving together and how fast they're moving. So you can start to get a lot more information about the way somebody's breathing. So, should we get cracking? Should we have a go? Yep, so we'll have a little go. So, I don't know if the first guinea pig wants to arrive on the stage. Hamza's going to do his magic. Okay, and we need the lights off, if that's all right. I can shut. Blue. Is that all right, Hamza? Okay. We'll see. Okay. Okay. So it just takes a bit of time to align the grid to the chest. And all we're going to do for the first part, we're just going to measure some resting breathing. Okay, we'll show you all the data after we've collected all three individuals' data. So
you just stay still and relax until you're going to scan it from the point, right?
okay. Okay. That light. Yeah, can you turn the projector off? Is that right? I thought you got away then, didn't you? Yeah, cool. Might have to substitute you for somebody else. Right, we just swap over because it's not picking all up very well. It's fine. We just the chat. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't know your name. Cool. Just want to tuck your shirt really tight, be sort of almost as tight as you can.
So it could be done also with a bit because we use.
Yeah. So probably the best way of doing it is actually with no top on, but obviously we're in rooms and we've got to have tops on. So sometimes it doesn't pick up so well with the white top, but we just try and. You might actually just pull that shirt so it's just really tight at the bottom. That's it. Cool. Okay. Working. Okay, so we're just measuring his respiratory rate now. I don't know if you can see the screen from where you are, but we're just getting nice inspiratory, expiratory patterns, and we're just tracking that for a minute. Usually when we do this with a patient, we sort of we do for about 5 minutes, don't we? Yeah, so 5 minutes usually, but just for the purposes of today, we're just doing a minute. And then what we're going to do after we've done our resting one, we're going to do a little bit of singing. So we're going to see how breathing pattern might change a little bit with singing.
You just relax and don't think about the breathing part.
Yeah. And the reason why you do it for 5 minutes is because it's a little bit like, I think someone said white coat syndrome before. You might need a couple of minutes just to relax into it, because obviously you know if someone's measuring your breathing, you're probably going to be more aware of your breathing. So. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's good. Okay. You happy to do a bit of singing as well? Yeah. Seems we're getting some good signals. Yeah. So Vivian's going to do a bit of singing.
So there's a little song I'll teach everyone. We can all sing it. And it's a song that was used in this, you'll see in the film, in this experiment, involving counting in increments of 2, starting with 8. And so the song goes like this. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, you teach it and then we'll...
So here we go. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16.
Okay. Got that? what happens after you get 16? What's after 16? It just keeps on going. Okay.
So you'll be singing that now?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
I can sing for
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. I can sing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20.
Excellent. Very good. Cool. Should we risk it and try a different participant? Yeah. Go on, we'll just have a little swap. Thanks very much for that. Cool. Do you want to come and sit up here? We'll do my Bonnie one, if that's all right. Is that all right? Do you want to teach them my Bonnie whilst we just set up? Do you know my Bonnie?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
So we're going to sing My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. My Bonnie lies over the ocean. My Bonnie lies over the sea. My Bonnie lies over the ocean. So bring back my Bonnie to me. Bring back, oh bring back my Bonnie
No, just go for it.
to me. Bring back,
So do you can line it up if you like. Is that okay?
oh bring back my Bonnie to me.
Just tuck your necklace.
My Bonnie lies
It just should be able to get just tuck underneath. That's fine.
My Bonnie lies over the sea. My Bonnie lies over the ocean. So bring back my Bonnie to me.
Cool. So finish it.
Bring back, oh bring back my Bonnie to me, to me.
was excellent, but we're going to do it again. Right. So, do you want to start it? Yeah, it should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. Yep, we're good. So whenever you want to start. Excellent. Fantastic. Lights can come back on. Nice one, thank you very much. Right, we need to have a quick change around of controllers and things. So this is the output we get when we're at rest. So if you don't want to play it for us, and if you watch the top left-hand corner, show that you can see as the breathe in, you can see the movement of the upper and lower chest and abdomen. If you tell you what happens, could you split it? Yeah, do you want to split it between the chest and abdomen so you can see that?
So the grid was covering the area from the chest, from the clavicles down to the belly button. We can split that.
Is that? Might as well unmute it. That's it.
Yeah. This is the overall.
And they should put it a bit higher up as well.
Oh, sorry. So you can see the movement of the whole grid projected on the thoraco-abdominal region of the subject, which could be split into chest versus abdomen, and we can see the signal from each bit and how it contributes in the overall movement of the whole region. We could also look at left versus right. Or if you'd like to compare quadrants, the upper chest, left or right chest, left or right abdomens, to compare the relative contributions in the overall movement. So going back to the chest versus abdomen. So if I choose a clean part, which I mean with that is a bit where the subject didn't move. So by looking at the grid and the trace at the same time, you can see that all of those are the movement of the grid, so that's breathing. Then we can look at the parameters. Can we, John, just move this to the left to see the parameters on the right side?
Don't think you might have to explain what they are. I don't think.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah.
So you do it. So if you click that, it might hit the screen. Yeah. Yeah.
So here you can see the quantified parameters. So this is a tidal breathing trace where we can quantify the respiratory rate, time indices, inspiratory time, expiratory time from the overall movement of the whole grid, and we can find the time ratios between them. Ti over Te, Ti over T total, the duty cycle, which is the time of inspiration divided by the overall time. We could look at the chest versus abdominal contribution in this movement. So it's here 57 to 43 in the selected bit. And the IE50, which simply describes the shape of this loop, which is the relation between the movement of the chest and the speed of that movement. We could also look at the phase lag, which is the time delay between chest and abdomen. So usually in a healthy subject, we expect the chest and the abdomen to move at the same time. But if there is any kind of obstruction or difficulties in breathing, there is some delay between them, which we quantify as degrees. So it's here 6.9 degrees. With some babies, during my research, I looked at babies with bronchiolitis. We could see up to 120 degrees of out of phase in breathing, which we call paradoxical breathing. So this is an objective measure to quantify these kind of parameters, which best explain the pattern of tidal breathing. So should we look at?
Let's look at the singing. Let's look at the counting one.
Okay.
Really, just have a look at that pattern. Just visualize that, and as we change it, see if you can notice any differences. Yeah. And also the angle.
This is the pattern at rest.
This is the resting one, yeah. See, because we're singing now, much more control and.
Yes.
So usually breathing parameters are quantified from each of those cycles. We also quantify something called within subject variability. So for each of those timing indices, we could look at the differences which is happening as they breathe. So with this subject, I would expect the variability in time indices to be, because it's more controlled, to be lower than when he was sitting and still breathing still. So there is a 50% use of chest. I mean, left versus right. They are equally used in breathing. Chest versus abdomen. Again, it's more toward the chest, I would expect. Choosing. So IE50, it's quite interesting. The IE50, which explains the shape of this loop, is very, very high. So it's usually between 1.5 to 2. But here it's very high for the reason that there is some kind of prolonged expiration happening. And if we look at the phase, the phase between chest and abdomen, because it's more controlled breathing, is dropped, is 1.3 degrees only. Was it the same subject?
It's got 6 points.
6
Yeah.
point
So
nine.
basically that means the chest and abdomen are moving much more in sync than they were at rest.
We could also choose a part of the chest if we'd like, for example, to look at the diaphragm movement alone and compare it to the overall movement. We could just
So we just say we want to look at the diaphragm and compare it to the rest of the breath.
So it's only 1.1, so 9% of the movement is coming from the diaphragm. We've looked at patient with diaphragm paralysis, and we could see a very low contribution from that part. And after some kind of breathing trainings, it was an improvement over time, and it was at the end up to I think 23% of the overall movement, which means that the exercise, they are responding to the kind of trainings done.
Do you want to do the My Bonnie one? Just bring up the My Bonnie. Again, just look at the trace and then maybe just compare it to the My Bonnie trace, because obviously that one, there's more standardization to the breath, so you know you're going to count, so you know roughly how much air you need to take, whereas the My Bonnie is a little bit not necessarily consistent where you're going to take your breath, so how you're going to release depending on the way on the part of the song. So on this one we had a little bit more noise as well, but you still get the idea of the pattern.
What's this song?
This is the My Bonnie song. So instead of the counting, it's the My Bonnie. There's a little bit more noise, so there's a bit more jagged edges, and if we were doing it as a research, we'd be a bit more precise around making sure the signal was clear, but you can still.
Yeah, the tightness of the top. We usually do it with a bare chest or with a very tight top. They were a bit loose, and also it's the kind of bra. If it's not white as well, it will affect the reading.
So if we choose only that part, this is
It's still very regular though, John.
Yeah. But maybe the breaths aren't quite as deep as the other one.
The breath phase increased to 61.2 degrees, and that's quite a lot.
Yeah. So maybe a little bit of asynchrony. You can see the peaks. So with this one, you can see where the peak of the abdomen is different to where the peak of the chest is. And that's what we're talking about, a little bit of asynchrony in there. So maybe we might work with you a little bit and try and get you moving together.
Right. The variations as well, which we calculate, we need at least 50 breaths. So because we look simply at the standard deviations and the interquartile ranges, so to get a robust quantification of that variability, we need at least 40 to 50 breaths. That's why we scan usually for 5 minutes. And we exclude the first and the last bit if there is any kind of changing the breathing pattern.
You can see on the actual, if you move it across, you can see that stomach moving before the chest moves. So you can see that when the breathes in, and then the chest goes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, you're saying that's natural because the diaphragm is down?
Well, you expect to see they should move together. So even though the diaphragm's moving down, you should still expect to see that movement and this movement sort of still happen together. So I find a lot of individuals that have been told to belly breathe do have that sort of pattern where they sort of go, so, and it's almost a two-phase to the breath. And what we're trying to suggest is, well, we don't know what the perfect breath is, but from what I've seen when I work with athletes, it tends to be more of a smooth breath in where it's all together. So the lower rib cage might initiate where the breath is, so you get that lateral movement out, then everything just sort of comes with it. That makes sense. But what we see in COPD patients is that asynchrony is present, whereas if you compare it to normal controls, it's not there. So it seems to be a trait of sort of some sort of dysfunctional breathing pattern, is that asynchrony between the stomach and the abdomen moving.
Is it the case, John, also that with breathing that there's some lateral movement?
Yeah. Can you pick lateral movement?
So simply the technology looks at the intersection points between black and white.
Yes.
So we measure the distance toward and backward from the camera.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's correct. There is some kind of movement. But since all the parameters which we quantify depends only on timing things,
Yes.
so we'd expect if there is an added component from that kind of movement, it won't affect the timing.
Yeah, but I think that's another common misconception is people think when they're breathing, it's all here, whereas there's lateral, forwards and up movement all together. So, and at the moment, the only real way you can measure that lateral movement effectively is by doing the test the other test I showed you, where we can sort of look at 89 markers and look at everything. So it's
just interested in this simply because obviously the people you're measuring do quite a lot of singing. They're singing 5 days out of 7 in the department, if not 7. And one of the things that we're taught is that you shouldn't be trying to breathe up here. I mean, obviously you feel everything, but you're trying to start when the diaphragm goes down, takes the air in, and you're trying to breathe down here. So it's possible that if someone is trained, then they would develop a little bit of what seemed to be this moving fractionally before.
Possibly. I mean, again, but we don't know, I guess, is the answer. So, because we haven't really used this in singers. So.
Just don't want to rush
No. And I think, as Hamza said, I mean, that was only 4 breaths, so it wasn't like a controlled trial or anything like that.
Can I just make the point, this is highlighting something that's really important for anyone learning to sing, and that is that we do not know. Because you will always get singing teachers saying, this is how to do it. And I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but I am saying that if they're backing it up with science, saying the diaphragm should do this, if they're saying the diaphragm should do this, this should happen, then this should happen, the sports science is well ahead of the game of singing science. So we know less than they know about the sports stuff. So if we've got someone stood here saying we don't know what the perfect breath is in terms of sports science, we definitely don't know what the perfect breath is in terms of singing. Okay, I'll stop ranting.
I think
just to make that point. So I'm really glad that this really highlights what needs to be done. So if you could do all this with singers for about 20 years and come back and let us know what the perfect breath is for singing, that'd be great. Thanks.
But I don't think there's going to be that much dissimilarity between the way you generate a big, because if you think about when you exercise, you don't necessarily want to take the biggest breath you can, but you want to sort of take the most natural big breath that you are for the exercise you're doing. It's the same thing with singing, really. So the way you're generating the breath probably isn't too dissimilar. It's just maybe when you're exercising, there might be a little bit more forceful expiration, whereas when you're singing, obviously you're going to control that expiration. So there will be differences, but I think the way you generate the breath probably isn't that dissimilar. There's a question at the back.
I don't do a lot of sport. The main difference that I'd noticed between taking a breath in sport and taking a breath in singing is that, especially in a choral setting, with singing, you don't often get a lot of flexibility with time to breathe. Maybe you like have a crotchet rest or a quaver or even a semi-quaver sometimes. So you have to be very selective of where you can breathe and how quickly you can breathe. I don't know how quick or how often sport people breathe. Sportists. Yeah. But that's the main difference that I'd point out is that they maybe have a particular repetitive breathing mechanism, whereas in singing you have to do long phrases, sometimes without taking breath at all, and so your breath is it can be very selective and very kind of weird, I guess. Yeah,
and I think there's comparisons. I mean, if you think about running or cycling, they can breathe whenever they really want to, but there are some comparisons. If you think about swimming, so their head's only out the water for a particular moment in time. And so, for example, with that swimmer we saw, that's going to have a real big impact if she's not getting that breath in effectively. She's then not having to work more without oxygen, so she's going to get tired quicker. So it's a very similar thing in certain sports about the timing of the breath. You might think about in rowing as well, it's the same thing, because they've only got, think about as they're going towards the catch, that's pretty much the point where they're going to take their breath. And so they're not going to be able to take a breath as they're pulling back. So there are certain sports where they do get this sort of entrained breathing, and it's not the same as singing, but it's the same sort of challenges where they have a sort of short amount of time to get a good quality breath. What we see is a lot of athletes, and it might be the same as singers, when they have that short period of time, they tend to jump to using the shoulders to pull the air in. The reason why people do that is because you can actually generate the flow of air faster by going, but what happens is, like I said in the evidence report before, is that because you've done that, you then lock the ribcage so it won't continue to expand. So you do get a fast flow of air, but you can't maintain it. So the actual overall volume you're breathing is less. And that's probably why as singers you say don't breathe from here, because it actually means you don't get as much air in. So what we try and do with athletes is get them to think about, if they're going to do a deep breath, it needs to come from down here. And you need to think about the lateral movement as well as the forward and the upward movement, but it has to come from here rather than here, and it all needs to go together. And then we try and train them by using various techniques. So we look at breathing technique, we look at posture. We use inspiratory muscle training as well, which is special devices to actually practice breathing in hard and fast. But we actually train them to do it with good technique, what we perceive as good technique, as opposed to just sort of letting them do it as they would normally. So it takes a bit of time, but I think you can take big deep breaths quickly, but it's just doing it appropriately as well is the key thing.
I think one of the things I think Jack might have been picking up on there as well was, so obviously you mentioned the swimming.
I feel like there's a sense that you can get in a rhythm with swimming and with cycling, whereas I think, I don't know whether this is what you're saying, but in singing, often the breathing can be really quite irregular. You can have to do, a really long breath, short. I don't know. Yeah. Especially in polyphony. Yeah. Yeah. But
I think the principle is, regardless of how long or short you're breathing, where you activate the breath from to take the breath back in again should be the same sort of pattern. And I think what's great about singing is it really helps you control that breathing. And the better and better you get at it, the better you control the way you're breathing.
The British Lung Foundation have been doing a programme of training existing singing teachers to work with people with long-term respiratory conditions, particularly with COPD. And we're really careful about how we work with people when we've done that. So we wouldn't do the sort of songs that you guys have been doing today where your breathing is irregular. So we really think really carefully about the repertoire that we use. We make sure that there are regular places to take proper full breaths. We use songs that have long song phrases, so we're getting people to exhale fully, and then they'll naturally take a deep breath in without thinking about it. And we also incorporate relaxation so that the posture's relaxed, all the things that you've just talked about, and deep breathing exercises. So I wouldn't go in and work with a group of people with COPD and do the sort of repertoire we've heard today, as amazing as it was to listen to. But it is very carefully kind of planned and prepared and incorporates all the things that you've just been talking about.
Because Stephen, you've sort of been part of the song selection for the stuff you've done down in Kent, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's similar to...
Very much so. I mean, our singing tutors were trained by Feeney Cave. Yeah. So, and we've had a close connection with the British Lung Foundation. And I think it's a very important point that you have to think carefully about the nature of the repertoire, the demand it places, and also whether it's possible for it to be progressive and structured. So over a period of time, it does encourage the kinds of things you describe very well, of extending the breath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's interesting. Some of the work that Hamza's colleagues done has demonstrated that COPD people, when we measure this with COPD versus healthy, their time, the breath time is shorter.
Yes.
With COPD, so they're doing more breaths per minute.
Yes.
And that encourages their phase, their abdomen and chest to be different as well. So they're more breathing out, and we're trying to get them out of that cycle.
Yes. One of the things that I think this illustrates very well, when you look at the whole range of research that has been done on singing and health, there's an awful lot that could be called qualitative, because it relies a lot on what people say about their experience. Where it attempts to be quantitative, the next step is to use standardized questionnaires of one kind or another that might be designed to measure the experience of different symptoms of COPD, or might be designed to measure anxiety or depression, and so on. And there are innumerable structured, standardized questionnaires that can be done. What we're seeing here is a movement towards something which is more direct and objective, that you're looking directly at what's happening. And I think it's fantastic to see the visual display. But then, of course, you said quantify many, many times. You want to find some way of converting these patterns into some numbers that actually do make sense and can then be used to measure in a very strong way what is happening and what is changing. So I'd kind of forgotten that I'd sort of found you out, John. I don't know quite how I did that, but it's a very nice example of a collaboration across different disciplines. And of course the science here, I mean, I've got no idea how you're doing it or how you derive these measures, but I can see that it adds a great deal to what we're trying to do to assess the benefits of singing.
Great. Should we show the video?
Shall we go on? I wonder if we should show the video of the Lambeth and Southwark project. So Hannah, could we swap over to that, and I'll just introduce it. And I think it's a very appropriate thing to end the day on, to hear from people with a very serious progressive illness talking about their experience of singing, what they've gained from it. And John's point was illustrated very well by this project that we conducted in South London, that over time, the measures that we used for lung volumes and how far people could walk in 6 minutes, really they didn't change, and in some cases they slightly deteriorated. And that is just happening, that's just a natural phenomenon associated with aging over time. We're all losing function in one way or another. But on the other hand, people's sense of benefit and improvement and the management of their condition was very clearly supported by this intervention, and we'll hear people talk about this. Yes.
Being able to measure something quantitatively is so important, well, certainly for my organisation, and I should imagine others as well, because when you're measuring the impact of what you've done and you're looking for further funding, qualitative data only goes so far, and people's tales and stories and recounts, as heartwarming as they are, it does help to have some statistics in all of this. So, yeah, thank you.
I think one other thing I'd add is that one of the things that is really vitally important is that we have studies of a sufficient duration, so that you can not only show benefits over a short period of time, but you can look at the extent to which they're maintained, but also particularly for people with long-term health conditions, does it make a difference to their utilisation of health services? And one of the things that you're going to hear on this film is one of the participants in one of our groups who says, since I started this, I haven't had an attack. And what she's talking about is an exacerbation in her condition, which previously has led her to be admitted to hospital. People with COPD can experience these phases. It might be associated with a respiratory infection, where the control of their breathing rapidly deteriorates, and they would need emergency care. And of course, it's very obvious that that's very, very expensive for the health service. So in the course of a project of the kind that you're going to see, if we can prevent one person being admitted as a matter of emergency to hospital, we've pretty much paid for the intervention. So the kind of health economics of this is also really very